I now, at present, I call the paper Socratic Authority, ELENCHUS, and Understanding. It'll be, or a prominent role will play the Socratic ELENCHUS. Right, recent socio-political phenomena, including the increasing popularity of conspiracy myths, anti-vaccination movements, or science denial more generally, have motivated observers to diagnose a crisis of authority. This crisis, if it is one, concerns not only political or other forms of practical authority, but also epistemic authority. People lose their trust in epistemic authorities and either try to figure out things for themselves or turn to fake authorities, adopting from them irrational and ungrounded explanations of phenomena or pseudo-theories. It is timely, therefore, that social epistemologists have recently begun to systematically explore epistemic authority. The most influential idea in this context so far is that epistemic authorities pass on true belief or knowledge to their interlocutors. For example, looking at expert authority, Alvin Goldman argues that expert authorities help others, especially laypersons, solve a variety of problems in a given domain D, or execute an assortment of tasks in D which the latter would not be able to solve or execute on their own. As the subject can provide such help, as the authority can provide such help by imparting to the layperson or other client his or her distinctive knowledge or skills. We've talked about this functional approach to epistemic authority already. Here I shall adopt the first part of this claim, but reject the second. That is, I agree that a natural and helpful approach to epistemic authority is a so-called service conception that takes its clue from the socio-epistemic role of that authorities play in their communities. Pacey Goldman, however, I believe that precisely this starting point suggests that the goal of our interactions with authorities is not confined to acquiring or maintaining true belief and knowledge. Indeed, when it comes to topics such as politics, religion, philosophy, or the cutting edge of science, perhaps the most important epistemic goal is understanding. In what follows, I outline what I call an inquirer model, which argues that, at least very often, the goal of authoritative epistemic interactions is the advancement of understanding. I illustrate this model with what I call Socratic authority. Being aware that for most of the big questions, or the bigger questions, knowledge cannot be had, Socratic authorities, well exemplified by the Platonic Socrates himself, aim not at disseminating knowledge, but at fostering understanding when they engage in such questions, the big questions. Among the key competences a Socratic authority must possess in order effectively to pursue this aim are meieutic and elenctic abilities. The latter constitute abilities to dialectically explore systems of thought, expose inconsistencies and other incoherencies in them, and thereby to sort out epistemically good from bad, tenable from untenable views. However, in order for this kind of discourse to be successful, the ELENCHUS, the famous art of refutation in Socrates, the ELENCHUS must also do something else. Typically, Socrates' interlocutors suffer from some form of intellectual hubris that blocks potential advancements in understanding. attenuating that hubris, neutralizing this epistemic vice, thereby helping agents to come to grips with their epistemic limitations and to adopt an attitude of epistemic humility, appears to be a typical goal of Socratic discourse and arguably of Socratic education more generally. But now the problem. Socratic authorities also want to cultivate intellectual autonomy in their interlocutors. Applying the ELENCHUS is not meant to shut them down completely or dishearten them in their intellectual efforts, but to the contrary, to encourage them to engage in critical thinking. The problem is that epistemic humility and the dispositions it involves seem to be in tension with the aim of cultivating intellectual autonomy, for awareness of one's limitations rather involves realization of one's social epistemic interdependence instead of independence, and suggests deference instead of self-sufficiency. In what follows, I flesh out this quandary and outline how I think it might be resolved. For a start, let us look at a paradigmatic Socratic authority, namely the Platonic Socrates himself. Consider the following passage from the Meno. I quote, Meno, "O Socrates, and this is on your handout, I used to be told before I knew you that you were always doubting yourself and making others doubt, and now you are casting your spells over me, and I am simply getting bewitched and enchanted and am at my wit's end. And if I may venture to make a jest upon you, you seem to me both in your appearance and in your power over others to be very like the flat torpedo fish. The flat torpedo fish who torpifies those who come near him and touch him, as you have now torpified me, I think. For my soul and my tongue are really torpid, and I do not know how to answer you. And though I have been delivered of an infinite variety of speeches about virtue before, and to many persons, and very good ones they were, I thought, at this moment I cannot even say what virtue is." Socrates replies, "As to my being a torpedo, well, if the torpedo is torpid as well as the cause of torpidity in others, then indeed I am a torpedo, but not otherwise. For I perplex others not because I am clear, but because I am utterly perplexed myself. And now I know not what virtue is, and you seem to be in the same case, although you did once perhaps know before you touched me. However, I have no objection to join with you in the inquiry." End of quote. In this passage, together with its context, many classic aspects of the Socratic method and of Socratic epistemic virtue surface. Among these virtues is curiosity, persistence, and as Federica and I would say, epistemic empathy is needed for a Socratic authority, and other virtues. But importantly, what we find here is also awareness of one's own intellectual limitations, as one can gloss the famous so-called Socratic ignorance. Such awareness is a basic aspect of the virtue of epistemic humility, as it has been dubbed in recent epistemological debates. Moreover, Meno's concession that he is at his wits' ends are the result of Socrates' ELENCHUS, his art of refuting untenable views by detecting incoherencies in his interlocutors' systems of thought and in their initial opinions. A note on Socrates' famous ignorance. In the dialogues, we do not, in fact, find the popular but self-contradictory formulation that Socrates knows that he doesn't know anything. This is actually nowhere in the Platonic writings, this gloss. In the Apology, the formulation should rather be translated as something like, I am aware that I am not particularly wise, neither concerning big nor small things. And, you know, there we can discuss the translation here, but that's consensus among Plato scholars. So it's not a self-contradictory, I know that I know nothing. The problem arises because this seems to conflict with what the Delphic oracle said, namely that Socrates is the wisest of all men. But the oracle is infallible, so it must be right. Socrates, in other words, disagrees with an infallible authority. His reaction, however, is not simply to adopt what the oracle says and to preempt his own reasons. After all, his view enjoys first-person authority and seems to be a piece of self-knowledge. In consequence, Socrates embarks on a journey in which he tests the oracle's claim. And this is what we should do, the Apology suggests, when disagreeing with an authority, at least when it comes to matters in which we are not completely clueless ourselves. The dialogue closes with the disappointing conclusion that virtue cannot be taught. In a pioneering article on understanding that also argues for the view that the central goal of teaching and education is not knowledge but understanding, Kate reconstructs the argument from the Meno in terms of what she calls Plato's teaching assumption. The view that teaching, I'm quoting, consists in conveying knowledge. It follows that one cannot teach what one does not know. Hence, if, as Socrates argues, no one knows what virtue is, then no one can teach virtue. However, if that were right, Kate argues, then, I'm quoting her, it is not just virtue that cannot be taught, neither can much of anything else. End of quote. But maybe it is wrong to construe teaching as knowledge transmission. Maybe we should rather construe teaching as advancing understanding, as Kate argues. I think that this is an important insight, yet I wish to amplify it, and I suggest a slightly different interpretation of the Meno and of the message in other early Platonic dialogues. As so far outlined, we have looked at, as we may say, the surface dialectic of the Meno. You can only teach what you know, no one knows what virtue is, and indeed neither is there much knowledge concerning any other of our bigger questions. Therefore, virtue cannot be taught, and neither can answers be taught to any of our other bigger questions. If we accept that teaching consists in knowledge transmission. However, I do not think that this is Plato's deep message, so to speak. Surely Meno makes some kind of epistemic progress, and the reader, even if they do not get the final answer about what constitutes virtue, has made epistemic progress when they have worked themselves through the dialogue. The progress we make, I suggest, is progress in understanding. In the Meno, this progress concerns various philosophical problems, not only concerning virtue, but also concerning the extra value of knowledge, the swamping problem, and so forth. In general, why Plato's Socratic dialogues do not claim this, they exemplify, in Goodman's and Elgin's sense, that the goal of teaching or education in the Socratic fashion is understanding. Yes, understanding is an important and perhaps concerning the big questions where knowledge cannot be had, the primary epistemic goal, but this view is not an alternative to, but rather part and parcel of Plato's model of inquiry and intellectual education. Let us now return to the role of the ELENCHUS, which, as we can see now, operates in the service of advancing understanding. As has often been observed, at least on the face of it, Socrates' elenctic art of refutation seems to work destructively. It shatters his interlocutors' noetic systems, leaving them at best puzzled or bewitched, if not, in Meno's words, desperate and torpified. In this context, we can distinguish two crucial functions of the ELENCHUS. The first is, of course, to sort out demonstrably false opinions from candidates that may remain in play. The second is to reveal and undermine an epistemic vice that has characteristically befallen Socrates' interlocutors, typically among the young men who have been educated with high fees by the sophists, including also politicians, artists, and others. I call that vice epistemic hubris. Roughly, an epistemic agent suffers from epistemic hubris when they first think they know when in fact they are ignorant, or when, more generally, they think they have reached some epistemic goal while in fact they haven't or have failed to do so. And second, when they are unwilling to engage in serious critical self-reflection and self-examination of whether or to what degree they have in fact reached the relevant epistemic goals. One insight of the Socratic or inquirer model of epistemic authority, I suggest, therefore, is that such attitudes of epistemic arrogance or epistemic hubris block making progress in understanding, and consequently, a first step in the Socratic program is to eliminate or neutralize the interlocutor's epistemic hubris. This is achieved through the operation of the ELENCHUS. This is an indispensable first step in preparing the ground for fruitful epistemic dialogue. There are two phenomena now which counterbalance this indispensable but largely destructive operation of the ELENCHUS. One is the fact that the interlocutors make progress in understanding and that they are aware of this. They do so precisely through realizing which opinions they ought to abandon and seeing for themselves that their overestimation of their epistemic achievements and intellectual competences and so forth, which result in intellectual hubris, is in fact deeply out of place. This overestimation is out of place, and they realize that in the Socratic discourse. The second fact that compensates for the destructive results of Socrates' ELENCHUS has to do with his maieutic way of getting his dialogue partners to see all this for themselves, despite having been led to their insight by their Socratic authority. By posing the right questions, Socrates guides them through the labyrinth of complex philosophical questions, yet puts them in a position to come up with the right answers themselves. These answers do not, of course, constitute definite answers to the big questions. Instead, they are answers that move the investigation forward and advance the interlocutor's understanding of the topic at hand. The interaction of a Socratic maieutic with the ELENCHUS is thus a first indication of how intellectual autonomy should be understood on the Socratic model. But now the problem. The positive counterpart of epistemic hubris is awareness of one's epistemic limitations, an attitude that may be identified, as I said, or is very close to what in recent discussion has been called epistemic humility. The aim of the ELENCHUS can thus also be portrayed as creating epistemic humility in the interlocutor. Following a recent proposal by Whitcomb, Batterley, Baer, and Howard Snyder, we may conceive of epistemic humility as roughly an attitude of being aware of one's intellectual limitations and their negative effects, and of caring about them in appropriate ways. Now comes the second part of the plot. The overall educational goal that Socratic authorities pursue, it seems, is to help their interlocutors becoming autonomous thinkers. Again, this is rather exemplified in many of the dialogues. It also comes up as a topic, for example, in the Meno, namely in the opening passages, Socrates asks Meno to report how Meno's teacher and friend Gorgias, the sophist Gorgias, defines virtue. I'm quoting, "Please remind me of what he said," Socrates invites Meno, or he continues, "if you would rather tell me your own view." Socrates adds justifyingly that he suspects that Meno and Gorgias think much alike anyway. Still, the overall course of the dialogue suggests that Meno is being trained in thinking for himself and being answerable to the claims he makes. So this is being accountable or being answerable to the claims he makes. The same holds quite obviously for many or most of the other Socratic dialogues. Again, this is not something that is said in the dialogues, but rather an insight they exemplify. The idea that, intellectual education should be education for autonomous thinking, towards autonomous thinking. Now an important question raises its head. How does all this fit with the aims and effects of the ELENCHUS? That is, how does the attempt to educate someone towards autonomy fit with fostering epistemic humility in them? According to a traditional, widely held view, autonomy pulls away from deference. The autonomous agent is not a deferential character. This has been debated extensively in work on practical autonomy, that is, autonomy concerning agency and one's will and choices. But an analogous view is prominent in epistemology as well. For example, in an early discussion, Lizzie Fricker characterizes the fully autonomous thinker as a person who, quote, takes no one else's word for anything, but accepts only what she has found out for herself, relying only on her cognitive faculties. This is Lizzie, 2006. Sandy Goldberg concurs when he says that an epistemically autonomous subject, I'm quoting, is one who judges and decides for herself, where her judgments and decisions are reached on the basis of reasons which she has in her possession, end of quote. Sandy, 2013. Or consider Duncan Pritchard, who characterizes intellectual autonomy as, I'm quoting, the goal of being epistemically self-reliant. Duncan, 2016. If these authors are right, then one characteristic goal I ascribe to authorities of understanding, and in particular to Socratic authorities, namely creating epistemic autonomy in their interlocutors, seems to sit ill with another, namely that of creating, if necessary, epistemic humility in them. As Jonathan Matheson and Kirk Loveyd have recently sketched this clash, quote, once we accept our own epistemic limitations, what, if anything, is the value of autonomy? There seems to be some tension between these two apparent intellectual virtues. Do we need to strive for a balance between intellectual humility and epistemic autonomy? End of quote. This is from 2022. An agent's awareness of their intellectual limitations rationally suggests extensive epistemic dependence on others. It suggests deference and interdependence instead of autonomy and intellectual independence. The upshot is that epistemic autonomy and epistemic humility seem to constitute two conflicting goals of Socratic intellectual education. It looks, therefore, as if we have hit upon a fundamental incoherence in the Socratic program. And more than that, the tradition of regarding both epistemic autonomy and epistemic humility as positive characteristics of epistemic agents extends into the present. That both constitute intellectual virtues, at least when they operate neither deficiently nor excessively. I take this from Heather Batterley, to which I come in a minute, is a widely held conviction among current epistemologists. However, there is a way out of this quandary to which I shall now turn. And now comes the section that has not really been written yet. the solution. There's a famous book in which one chapter says this section has not yet been written, and this is David Kaplan's demonstrative. Now, I'm not David Kaplan, so I probably won't get this stuff published without really writing this section. So, but I'm not quite there yet. Well, I shall give you the ideas. The quandary, as so far discussed, relies on the wrong picture of epistemic autonomy, or a simplified picture. And I think Johanna said that Sandy and Lizzie for sure, she always complains and says, people always quote my 2006 paper. They shouldn't read my 2006 paper, but my 2016 paper or 2013. And I think Sandy is very nuanced on these issues too. But Duncan Pritchard still sticks to this self-reliance idea. I'll have to check this. So, but these were early. I mean, these were early formulations of the core idea of epistemic autonomy. So this is a good start. But recent work on this issue have really nuanced the view, and I'll introduce some of this now to you. So the classic picture identifies autonomy with self-reliance and total intellectual independence, but that is mistaken. In fact, in more recent work, some authors have corrected or nuanced the traditional picture of epistemic autonomy and argued from various viewpoints for so-called relational accounts of intellectual autonomy. Accounts, that is, which emphasize that autonomy, far from excluding reliance on others, rather requires it. I think that the picture of Socratic authority, as I have outlined it here, is precisely a member of this family, or indeed the big anchor, the big anchor of this view. And here is why, and where in that family Socratic authority has its place. Nathan King has recently argued that intellectual autonomy requires, I'm quoting, thinking for ourselves while relying on others appropriately, neither too much nor too little, end of quote. Similarly, Jonathan Matheson argues that the virtue of epistemic autonomy requires the capacity of good judgment about when, quote, to rely on your own thinking, as well as how and when to rely on the thinking of others, end of quote. Heather Batterley elaborates on such views and suggests first not to run together autonomy and interdependence in one virtue, as King and Matheson do, but to distinguish between autonomy and also, so the second point that Heather makes is we should distinguish autonomy and interdependence as traits versus virtues. And the question is, when do the dispositions associated with autonomy and interdependence, autonomy on the one side and interdependence on the other, when do these traits become intellectual virtues? And her idea is that, you can have these traits and exercise the relevant dispositions excessively, and then it's not a virtue, or deficiently, and then it's not a virtue either. So we have to actually add these constraints if we want to get out virtues. And so Heather argues that the trait of intellectual autonomy does indeed consist in, I'm quoting her, a behavioral disposition to think independently, to think for oneself, to rely on one's own cognitive faculties, and so forth, while this must go along with a motivational disposition to want to behave in these ways. However, the virtue of intellectual autonomy consists in, quote, a behavioral disposition to consistently think for oneself at the right times, in the right ways, and with respect to the right objects. This avoids deficiency, and to consistently think for oneself only at the right times, in the right ways, and with respect to the right objects. And this clause avoids excess. Excess with E. End of quote. All this must go along with an ulterior. I mean, she also talks about proximate motivations, but the essential thing here is that this has to go along with an ulterior motivational disposition to want to think for oneself appropriately, because one cares about epistemic goods. So it's got to be connected with the right kind of motivation. If you just happen to behave that way, that would not be virtuous. I think this is the idea here. Now, similarly, the virtue of intellectual interdependence consists in, quote, a behavioral disposition to consistently think with others at the right times, in the right ways, and so forth, and to consistently think with others only at the right times, in the right ways, and so forth. While again, this must go along with an ulterior motivational disposition to want to think with others appropriately, because one cares about epistemic goods. I think that this goes a long way in the right direction. Intellectual autonomy cannot reasonably be identified with total independence or intellectual autarky. Nor should intellectual interdependence be defined so as to imply habitual deference, come what may. This cannot be what we reasonably mean with these concepts. But if we explicate both these virtues in the way Batterley suggests, they become compatible. The disposition to think for oneself, whenever and wherever this is appropriate, perfectly harmonizes with the disposition to think with others, whenever and wherever that is appropriate. Is this then the end of the story? Well, not quite. And here is why. The problem with Batterley's approach, I think, is, well, I don't know whether it's a problem, but is that it remains entirely formal. Yeah? So you add these clauses, and then and suddenly autonomy and interdependence fit together, and the feeling is, well, you've added these formula just to make it compatible, and where is the substantive account here of intellectual autonomy? And that, I think, is missing from Heather's wonderful paper. So let's see where I think we should go here. Consider work in practical philosophy on self-governance and responsibility for self. We may take up here an influential proposal by Andrea Westlund in a paper, in a peer-reviewed paper from 2003. Inspired by Dworkin, Westlund spells out autonomy regarding choice and action in terms of, so here we're dealing with work on practical, in practical philosophy and on practical autonomy. Yeah? So what these guys say is, holding oneself answerable for one's endorsements to external critical perspectives, that's essential for practical autonomy. And this culminates, according to Westlund, in, quote, a standing disposition to engage in self-critical reflection that takes a dialogical form. This is motivated by a critic. So this is in the tradition of Frankfurt-style identificationist view of self-coherence and self-responsibility. And now what Dworkin says is, this hierarchical account of the will and coherence in your hierarchy, volitional hierarchy, that's not enough. We need more because of course we are up in an infinite regress here. What about the higher order preferences and volitions? Where's the critical stance actually? If you just say we have coherence in your volitional hierarchy, so Dworkin and Westland, they say, we need something else. We need something like critical reflection. So one would have to go into details. I don't have the time here to do that, but so my point is that this approach that this is on the right track, and that this approach can mutatis mutandis fruitfully be applied to our epistemic quandary as well. Or so I shall argue in the section that hasn't been written yet. far from ruling out intellectual humility, the willingness and disposition to engage in self-critical reflection just is a rational consequence of being aware of one's intellectual limitations. Yeah? So epistemic humility suggests that you should engage in self-critical reflection. And this is, of course, precisely what the Socratic dialogues tell us. The alleged clash between the two basic goals of Socratic discourse and Socratic education, namely, or the intrinsic clash between two aims that are suggested in the Socratic discourses, namely epistemic autonomy, between epistemic autonomy and epistemic humility, can thus be reconciled. In fact, these are just two aspects of one and the same goal, namely to become an autonomous thinker. Thank you.